Well, we're early on into 2026 and already it's extremely dramatic. I was hoping to come to you with uh, some light, fluffy, abstract or intellectual conversations to interrogate how we live our lives and things like that. And I've written a few episodes and we'll still get to them. But now, thanks to popular request from a few listeners, I'm going to be diving into what I think about the situation in Venezuela with a focus on what it means for world affairs, with a few useful shorthands in how to cut through what is a large swathe of, frankly, nonsense. Some of it deliberate, where actors such as the US are incentivized to give garbage information out or to justify actions, and nonsense where there's a large commentariat, as always, which is full of people who have been wielding whatever view it is they have about the world like a hammer for decades, and they need whatever event that occurs to further justify that position. So trying to get past some of that, understand a bit of the historical context and what the ramifications might be. So thanks so much for joining me. And if you're a regular listener, thanks so much for your patience. I've had a couple of weeks off as moved house. And as you can see, I'm not in my regular spot. Currently on the road in Portugal, having a great time. And we'll be back regularly with you all for the year. And I'm really excited. Just it's a personal note, but my son, Mihai, will be starting kindergarten at some point this year. So I'm going to get a huge swathe of time back. And I intend to spend most of it upping the quality of this podcast for you because it was one of my favorite things last year. Wherever you are, I hope you've had a nice, peaceful rest and that you're somewhere safe and excited about the year to come. Thanks especially to my Patreon patrons. If you'd like to join up, head on over to patreon.com/Andrew. There's a bunch of tiers, including a free one, which allows you to vote on upcoming episodes. So please do get involved because it's what makes it fun. And as I said, this topic was only picked because a few listeners got in touch with me saying they wanted to hear what I thought of the situation. But more on that on the other side of the music. I'll see you there. So we're coming onto a week now since Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were captured from Caracas in the middle of the night in a very impressive operation from US Special Forces in conjunction with, I think, the DEA and the Army and Navy and whatever. I don't know the specifics. And it's a dramatic start to the year. I don't know if this operation must have been planned for many months and is not the result of just a quick smash and grab, but would have taken a lot of intelligence on the ground and all the positioning that we've seen of the US military forces, the Navy in particular, moving through the Caribbean across the past few months. And it was a coup, not in that they've overthrown the government, more on that later, but a coup in that it was a very successful operation. They were able to get in and out, no US casualties seemingly, and they've stolen the president and his wife of another country. And they're sitting in prison in New York at the moment. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. I don't want to join in the speculation of what occurred and how it occurred because I think it's always the case that we don't know. Even the people very close to the center often don't fully know what's happening in these situations in terms of the why and the subsequent consequences in particular. But with this event, perhaps even more than others, I think it's clear that we don't know because there's a lot of hanging questions around the operation, like why were there no shots fired by the Venezuelan air defenses and army? I think there was only one helicopter that was shot upon. Why was it so easy to capture someone who would have been on red alert security-wise for this type of thing to happen? And why is this seemingly the end of that situation? I mean, spoiler alert, of course it's not, but is America at war with Venezuela? Did they declare a war? I don't think so. And was the objective to overthrow the Venezuelan state? No, because they've just arrested 2 people. And yeah, so there's clearly more that will come out in time. With this stuff, I try not to get too lost in the details of understanding what happens in the moment because it's impossible. We don't get full information for many reasons. But instead, one great way to see the types of things that can happen is to read into histories of the past. And it also offers peace on the more shocking response because of the first instinct, I've seen a lot of people be shocked that America can do this. So my first response to this is just a kind of fascination with how it's going to play out socially because whilst fans of American history in particular will know there's nothing new for America to overthrow a state or to even to arrest a leader is not a new thing, particularly in Latin America. And of course, there are many instances of assassinations or being party to overthrows, including of democracies all over the world in the last century. But what's interesting in this one is that it comes at a time where there have been years of moral grandstanding and positioning of state policy on the grounds of an international rules-based order, which is, of course, as made up as anything, but doesn't mean it's not real. It just means what it has meant is it's been something that's been selectively enforcing by the most powerful in the spheres in which they are powerful. But that's all well and good for us to say and see from the sidelines. But for those in the arena of politics who have spent years fashioning their career around these alleged ideals and fashioning their legitimacy around upholding them, what do they do in a situation where the clear global hegemon is in such flagrant breach of standard acceptable practice and stated international laws to which they are a party? And it has been funny and shameful and disgusting watching those who are downstream of US power respond to this, because there have been shamefully few voices declaring it as obviously brazenly illegal to go into another country and to arrest their president and wife, and particularly on such flimsy charges, and kidnap them back to your country. And yeah, I mean, there's instance after instance of leaders of the UK, Germany, France, Australia, the European Union, etc., standing in front of journalists and being unable to answer the question, was it legal or not? And, the standard line is, well, we value international law. Yes, but was it legal? International law is something that we value, and there are questions to be asked. And I want to say I'm determined to say that it's a complicated situation, or whatever it is. These are all the same countries, institutions, if not the exact same people who for the last 4 years have been holding up the ideal of democracy, legitimacy, international law process as a kind of Bible to fuel the war between Russia and Ukraine to the nth degree, to the million plus deaths or whatever they're up to now. And suddenly it's not so clear, and there is room for nuance and questions to be asked, etc., etc. Of course, if you're a long-term listener of the podcast, you'll know that this is not a new phenomenon, and these inconsistencies have always been clear, particularly in the last few years, as we've seen everything from mild criticism through silence onto blatant support for Israel and its campaign against the citizens of Gaza and the sovereign territory of neighboring countries. There's been precious little said about that by comparison to Russia's incursion into Ukraine. And so it's already very clear from simultaneous events that the international law and the so-called international rules-based order and systems are made up and selectively enforced. But now it's kind of a head explosion level hypocrisy. The standard lines used to justify this stuff are become impotent, and that is perhaps something that is new. So I said that it's not new for the Americans to go in and arrest presidents. It's not new for them to overthrow states. It's not new for them to use violence against the international standards to which others are upheld. But what does seem to be new is the brazenness with which they've done it. I saw a great meme contrasting quotes between presidents that had George Bush Sr. saying this is about helping Kuwait, it's not about oil. His son saying this is about helping Iraq, it's not about oil. And then Trump saying, this is about oil, they stole our oil. And the whole thing kind of reminds me of a great line that Mark has in Peep Show, trying to get out of a wedding engagement that he's made. And his friend Jez is telling him just to end the engagement. And he says, you don't just declare war, Jeremy. You prime the press. You square things with the UN. You make up your reasons. And I think that might be the interesting point of transition to look at here, which is, for the whole time I've been alive, at least, every war has come with a manufactured consent and a series of lies, I suppose, a series of subsequently proven absolute lies wielded as tools to generate legitimacy for those wars. Whereas now we're barely being fed that kind of respect. This is the contempt with which they're treating us. We're not told, oh, well, Venezuela's weapons of mass destruction. I mean, we were given a whole bunch of pretty frail things, including the president is the head of a cartel called the Cartel of the Sun, and it's a drug racket. But then immediately that was dropped. The Justice Department in the US is not pursuing that. And instead he's been arrested on charges of possession of machine guns. I mean, whatever irony machine you can construct must be exploding at the idea of Americans arresting citizens for possession of firearms, let alone foreign citizens, as a legitimate operation. What's clear that's happening is the US wants a particular outcome, and they're pursuing it with the force that they have. There's kind of not much more than that at its core. Yet in the press, So much of the dialogue surrounds the legitimacy or otherwise of the regime, the idea of what better life would be like for the Venezuelan people. I mean, I should say the Venezuela's been living under very strict sanctions from the US for many years, basically because they're not playing ball with the Western vision of world power and I guess subservience to US economic, cultural, military hegemony. And now they will. The great clue that whatever reasons we're given about the kidnapping are just made up is that there hasn't been an overthrow of the state in Venezuela at all. The vice president is still there. The entire government is still there. The army is still there. Every structure you could name in Venezuela is still there, except now their oil is being captured, stolen by the US. And there was a statement by Trump earlier in the week that they're going to control the sale of that to the US market at market prices, and they're going to control where the profits from that go to benefit the Venezuelan and American citizens. So there's no real framework. It looks like they're just going in, and colonialism is back in a more brazen form. Accepting, of course, that it's something that exists in many spheres in a de facto way. It seems like a case of them going in, getting rid of one leader and running the country as they will, for their own benefit. And I mentioned the oil. Much of the talk is oil. Venezuela has the largest known reserves of oil. I'm not an oil guy, but my understanding is it's not as economically exploitable as the oil in Saudi Arabia or Texas, for example. They talk about light, sweet, and heavy sour. I hope no one's actually tasting the oil, but it refers to the difficulty to access it and exploit it, and how much money you need to spend to get the value of whatever it is that you extract. And it's more expensive to access this oil, but over time, I guess they want to control it. And so this is also a big part of it. You hear the Monroe Doctrine invoked as though it's a law of nature. The Monroe Doctrine comes from the early president of the US, who determined that they should be the only superpower controlling what occurs within the Western Hemisphere, as in North, Central, and South America. And this determination at the time meant that the US would permit no European powers to retain strong interests or military presences within the Americas. And now it's being invoked as part of the pivot against China, because Venezuela was buying some Chinese oil, so there's an interest there. Russia's buying Venezuelan oil and supporting the regime, so there's an interest there. And they're kind of just saying that, well, this is our backyard, you get out, which is a funny one because in a tit-for-tat world, if we accept that it's reasonable for the US to control the sovereignty of countries in its area just because it's more powerful, then what does that do for how we feel about Russia and what it's doing in Ukraine, or China and what it may intend to do with Taiwan? And then all down the line, any other conflicts that may subsequently emerge that you can't predict. It's a redrawing of the rule book in a sense. And I want to talk about that more later, because it's my assessment, humble citizen of no affiliation and with very little skin in the game, that it's a bad idea or even a disastrous idea. But I'll get into that later. But yes, something I do want to make really clear is that this isn't maybe as new as it might feel. This isn't just a case of Donald Trump being a new type of fascist leader who's happy to ignore norms and use the army or whatever. These types of operations have been occurring for decades, more than decades. US presidents have used military power to achieve goals in supposed US interests, more often US corporate interests, for the whole time. I keep thinking of it as it's a time for cynics, because if you're skeptical about the narratives of building democracy or liberating people from tyranny or whatever it might be, you're kind of proven correct to see the US march into one country that they don't like, physically kidnap the president and his wife, and then seize control. And then their first order of business is not to change the government in any way, but to seize control of all of the oil. It's a hard time to be invoking the great ideals of why these things have been ostensibly said to occur in the past. But I think it's fair to say that when you do look at the other wars of our lifetime, Afghanistan, Iraq, the first Iraq war, and then going back, certainly Vietnam and Korea, and all of the ones that we hear about less in between, the interference in the Congo, Chile, Iran, multiple times, Honduras, Syria, Libya, across the gamut. There's any number of US interventions, and there's nothing about this current one that is out of line from any of those. It's really, I think, worth remembering that as you see the commentary react to what's occurring at the moment, whether for or against. But the one thing that I did say, that I alluded to that is different, but the one thing that I mentioned that is different is the kind of flavor of it and how it's being talked about. There's a brazenness, and I think it started with where you see the current Secretary of War in the US, Pete Hegseth. They explicitly renamed the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And there's a kind of unapologetically selfish, American interest-driven behavior behind American foreign policy and defense policy at the moment that hasn't had the same fig leaf as in the past. And I'm confident to say that the idea behind that is to project an expression of confidence and certainty and pride and strength. But it's my assessment that it's the opposite. That is what we're seeing, that we're seeing these types of behaviors because the empire is in decline, both internally and relatively externally. And the corrosion of those two power sources is leading to more explicit lashing out and the old ways of doing things as being ineffective, both because there's not total social alignment behind certain outcomes, so certain things can't be done in particular ways. Also because the first time in a couple of decades, there's fear of a genuine peer competitor emerging in China, and in the chance that in the future there'll be a reduced capacity for the US to express its will in the world in the way that it has so freely for quite a while now. And maybe it's counterintuitive, but I don't know if you've played a lot of sport or anything like if you have a football coach that has to yell at you and bash you to do anything, they're probably less respected and feared and effective than the football coach who speaks quietly and everyone leans in and wants to do the right thing. That's a pretty ham-fisted analogy, but I think that that's kind of what's occurring here. And I'll talk through my reasoning. Other than the obvious situation where you can see that there's an increase in economic, manufacturing, military, say whatever you want, Chinese power relative to the US, even putting all of that to the side for the moment, I think what's easy to lose sight of here is that these international norms and international laws and this so-called rules-based order that is being undermined here by the current American administration, these are not rules from heaven that are written for the good of everyone in mind. These are rules that have largely come from America in the post-World War II order, Bretton Woods institutions, UN, various structures that were drafted by and led by the US, in part to entrench US global power. And so the undermining of those norms is something that doesn't serve them, in my opinion, doesn't serve them well at all. Because the alternative to those systems is either some new system that everyone will generate together, and that's not something that the globe has proven very good at doing, or the reversion to raw, realist use of power to achieve things. Now, that's fine if you are uniformly the most powerful entity in the world, and the US still is in many ways. If you look at the military spending for them, I think they're more than the next 10 combined or something silly like that. But that is a power that's waning and in relative decline. And it's, as they say, you catch a lot more flies with honey than with vinegar. I'm not sure who wants a bunch of flies, but the principle stands. The US soft power is something that is not worth throwing away, that is being thrown away in abundance at the moment. And you don't need to look far. You could look at the oldest allies. I feel like lately, every week, there are statements that come from nations and their political leaders that would have been unthinkable for generations prior. And one of them that stands out from this week is that leading European powers, the UK, Germany, France, have banded together to make a statement that they will defend Greenland militarily from US incursion should that occur. This type of stuff really would have been unthinkable. Even 3 weeks ago, to me, it would have been unthinkable that they would have issued a statement like that. And as much as the US spends a huge amount of money to maintain the security architecture of Europe, Europe is still 400 whatever million people and huge economies, and they may not have a comparable military power at the moment, but having them being acquiescent to US interests in terms of corporate agreements and trade, etc., is of huge benefit to the US. And it does seem that they're kind of throwing that stuff slowly out the window because and by design, that it's been very obvious for years that Donald Trump explicitly has said that it's foolish for America to pay for NATO security. And maybe that's the case. But in prompting the Europeans to pay for their own security, there'll be doubtless unintentional consequences that will also cost the US in its relative decline. But most importantly, as made up and fake and useless as various international laws appear to be, in that nobody's sanctioning any of the permanent members of the UN Security Council for going to war. There were no consequences for Great Britain, despite not being that powerful, for invading Iraq. Russia's not kicked out of the UN for invading Ukraine. These laws kind of don't really exist except for where they're enforced. But the problem with that is where there isn't even the illusion that these laws are important, where there isn't even the illusion that there's legitimacy behind the idea that the people have rights that extend further from whatever it is they're physically able to enforce. It creates a more volatile world where those who have strength will seek to exert it against those who don't in increasing ways where there is no consequence. And it's hard to speculate where that world goes. We've already seen many instances of it, with Azerbaijan taking Nagorno-Karabakh and doing the ethnic cleansing of Armenians there just last year, basically to not a peep. Israel seizing parts of Syria and Lebanon, basically to not a peep, at least in terms of international actors holding them to account. There must be thousands of instances of those types of conflicts that are a whisper away, both large and small, across the planet. And much like I discussed with nuclear weapons being a complex factor that needs stability, and the more moving pieces you have, the greater the likelihood that you end up with a disaster occurring that you can't control. It's kind of the same when we invite volatility and chaos into the international system, frail as it already is. I spent a large part of last year hearkening back to 1914 and the years prior to that, with kind of a fixation on and trying to figure out, what did people think at the time of what was occurring? Where did people think things would go, and what was the cause of that? The answer generally is people have no idea of the magnitude of the things that are in motion, and things that seem to seem very obvious in retrospect are still difficult to understand. The causes of World War I, which is World War II, inevitably, and then the consequences of authoritarian communism across hundreds of millions of billions of people's lives now. These things, we're bad at understanding them in retrospect, but we're impossibly bad at predicting them in advance. And so perhaps the most certain thing that we can say about what's occurred in Venezuela is it's not the end that we're going to hear about this. It's not the case that the US were able to go in, arrest Maduro and his wife, take all the oil. That's the end of that chapter. Venezuela continues, it gets a bit of sanctions relief, things get more prosperous, and quote unquote freedom wins, and America gets oil dominance. Like that's not how this story goes. That's not how it went in Libya. It's not how it went in Iraq. It's not how it went in Korea. It's just generally not how high stakes interventions go, because of just the certainty of unintended consequences. And when you're dealing with big stake stuff, the likelihood that those are also large stakes. To give another example, as a part of this movement this week, we saw the US seize an oil tanker full of Venezuelan oil on its way to Russia. And it was Russian flagged, and a Russian submarine was on its way to protect it, but didn't get there in time. And so they were able to seize this. If this sort of stuff is fair game across the board now, what do we see? Those of you who have followed the work of Peter Zeihan, who I actually went right off because of his poor predictions in the Russian conflict and because of his total silence on Israel's war on civilians in Gaza. But his core premise in a lot of his reading of the world as a realist is quite good, which is that we get a lot of benefits from a globalized, interconnected world that have scaled up commercial viability, and even just the amount of people that we're able to have alive through food production and things like that. And that's gone up exponentially. And his thesis is that goes down exponentially as we lose these. And I think that's a really interesting idea that's worth looking at, because if we're seeing the case that we can no longer safely send an oil tanker from South America to Europe, then it's going to be more expensive to do basic business. And, when you think about an iPhone, I mean, how many components does an iPhone have? Yeah, so an iPhone has around 2,700 components sourced from 28 to over 40 countries. You don't need too much volatility in the system to make small elements of that more expensive for the overall project to be much more expensive for the overall project to, in many instances, become not viable. So there could be big losses to come from this increased volatility, not to mention, of course, the risk of global war and nuclear strikes and all of that other horrible stuff that I talk about all the time because I'm such a cheery guy and like to brighten your mood. Yes, so that's my broad assessment of what's occurred in Venezuela and where it's going to go. Sorry if you were hoping for an explainer about the specifics of Venezuelan society and what life's going to be like for people there. Broadly, I would just say, I don't know, and the experts that claim to know, they don't know either. I didn't see many people predicted the downfall of the Taliban, that we would be talking about the Taliban sending a team to the Olympics in LA in 2028, but that's where we are. And similarly, it's hard to know here, other than that volatility is too chaotic to manage no matter how powerful you are, and that we live in a precarious world that is, I would say, not at all as it is described to us in most conventional sources of explaining and defining how the world works, what's occurring, and what the meaning of things are. So don't fall to cynicism where you think everything sucks all the time, because the world's great, but don't put away your skeptic's magnifying glass when you read about what's happening from abc.net news because they didn't report on the US blowing up Nord Stream at all. And I think that's one of the most important things of our time. There's a lot more to the world than it's presented, and that includes for those who are at the center of things and think they understand what's occurring. They almost never do because you almost never can. Okay, wishing you a peaceful. With that said, I'll be back next week with a much more exciting and invigorating topic I want to talk to you about. I want to give you all a little pep talk on why you deserve to be radically prioritizing the things you want in life, and it promises to be a much cheerier episode. I hope that wherever you are, you're safe and sound and have plenty of love in your life. And thanks so much for listening to the podcast. Delighted to be back on board with you for 2026. If you find any value in this, please do send it to people you know who might like it. Of course, you've already given me 5 stars and thumbs up, so thank you so much. If you haven't, well, I'll give you a leave pass. Just do it now. That's fine. That's fine. And if you're interested in supporting the show in other ways, jump over to patreon.com/Andrew. Take care now. Speak soon.